The dog didn't walk away from the girl's casket, but what the biker did notice amazed everyone. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching from. The light in the modest kitchen of the James household flickered softly as the sun dipped beneath the rooftops of Harper's Cross. It was a Friday evening in early spring, and the neighborhood, a patchwork of small brick homes and rusting trailers, settled into its habitual silence as the scent of fried food and distant traffic mingled in the air. Inside one of the aging duplexes, 6-year-old Aaliyah James sat cross-legged on the faded linoleum floor, coloring with intense concentration. Her crayon moved in slow, deliberate strokes across the paper, forming the outline of a dog with floppy ears and kind eyes. Aaliyah's mother, Sandra, stood over the stove, her nursing scrubs wrinkled from a double shift. She stirred a pot of rice while glancing occasionally at her daughter, her gaze heavy with exhaustion but softened by love. Sandra had worked at the local hospital for nearly a decade, spending her nights on the pediatric floor, caring for other people's children while her own waited at home. The burden of single motherhood rested heavily on her shoulders, but she bore it with quiet resilience, refusing to show the wear and tear life had etched into her. "That one's Diesel," Aaliyah announced without looking up. Her voice was small and matter-of-fact. "He's a hero dog. He helps people breathe." Sandra turned, wiping her hands on a towel. "Diesel, huh? Sounds like a strong name for a strong dog." Aaliyah nodded solemnly. Her drawing showed the dog standing beside a girl in a hospital gown, holding an oxygen mask. Beneath it, in the shaky letters, she had written, "My dog friend." Sandra didn't correct her. She never did when it came to Aaliyah's dogs. The girl had an affinity for strays and rescues, though they couldn't afford to keep pets. When she wasn't drawing them, she was stopping to talk to the ones that wandered through the alleyways. She'd once told Sandra, "Dogs don't mind when I wheeze. They just sit with me till it passes." Sandra smiled faintly but rubbed her temples, fatigue wrapping around her like a tightening shawl. She looked at the clock. It was past 6, and they still hadn't eaten. She lifted the pot off the stove and called Aaliyah to the table. Dinner was quiet. Aaliyah picked at her food, distracted by her imagination. Sandra ate quickly, mentally calculating the rent, the power bill, and the copay for Aaliyah's next asthma medication refill. It was always a juggling act. Shift trades, payment plans, a patchwork of survival. There had been no child support in years. Aaliyah's father had vanished before her first birthday. As the sun fully disappeared and the street lights flickered to life, Sandra tucked her daughter into bed. The inhaler rested on the nightstand beside a plastic water bottle. Aaliyah clutched a stuffed lion, its mane matted from years of affection. "Tell me the dog story again," she whispered. Sandra stroked her daughter's hair. "The one about the dog who could sniff danger?" Aaliyah nodded. "Well," Sandra began softly, "once there was a brave dog who could smell when people were about to get sick. He'd bark and bark until someone came to help, and because of him, lots of people got better." Aaliyah's eyes began to flutter closed. "That's Diesel," she murmured. Sandra kissed her forehead. "Good night, baby." The next morning began with the sound of wheezing. Sandra jolted awake to the rasping gasp of her daughter's breath. She rushed into the room to find Aaliyah sitting upright in bed, eyes wide with panic, clutching at her chest. Her skin was pale, and her lips were tinged blue. "Aaliyah, breathe with me, in, out, slow," Sandra instructed, already reaching for the rescue inhaler. She administered 2 puffs, then sat behind her daughter, holding her steady. But this time, it didn't work. Sandra called 911, trying to keep her voice level. She cradled her daughter against her chest, whispering reassurances while the girl's breaths came faster, shorter, thinner. The ambulance took 21 minutes to arrive. When it finally did, the EMTs moved without urgency. They loaded Aaliyah onto the stretcher and asked perfunctory questions. At the hospital, Sandra followed them into the emergency department, where the fluorescent lights hummed and the staff moved like ghosts. Dr. Walter Hughes, an older man with thinning gray hair and a condescending smile, examined Aaliyah without looking Sandra in the eye. He made no move to intubate or order a bronchodilator via nebulizer. Instead, he charted while standing, muttering that it was likely an anxiety reaction, and told the nurse to monitor for 15 minutes. Aaliyah's body began to go limp. Sandra screamed. By the time a code was called, it was too late. Or so they said. Dr. Hughes signed the death certificate before an autopsy could be requested. Complications of acute asthma, the document read. Sandra collapsed into a chair. Her scrubs were still stained from her shift. Her eyes were dry, wide, stunned. No tears came. Not yet. The hospital chaplain offered empty condolences. Arrangements were made in a blur of paper and platitudes. Aaliyah's small body was cleaned and dressed in a white dress she'd worn to a church recital. The funeral was set for 3 days later. News of Aaliyah's death passed quietly through the community. In Harper's Cross, loss was not uncommon. Black and brown children from the South Side had a way of dying before their time, some from violence, some from disease, others from the slow neglect of a system designed to fail them. The neighborhood mourned, but not loudly. It was not the first child funeral, and no one believed it would be the last. The day before the service, Sandra received a phone call she hadn't expected. It was from a voice she hadn't heard in nearly 10 years. "I heard about Aaliyah," said the gravel-toned voice. "I'm coming." She didn't respond. She hung up the phone and stared at the wall. She hadn't told him. She hadn't wanted him there. The next day, the sound of a motorcycle echoed through the quiet streets of Harper's Cross. It arrived like a storm. Black paint, chrome, and dust. The man who stepped off the bike wore a weathered leather jacket patched with a Veterans Motorcycle Club emblem. Tattoos snaked down his arms, and his beard was streaked with gray. His face was hard, carved by years and guilt. Beside him trotted a massive German shepherd, its stride purposeful, eyes sharp. Melvin Rhodes had returned. The funeral home staff watched him with unease. The guests, many of them older church-going women in dark dresses, whispered disapproval. Sandra didn't look up when he entered. He approached quietly, removing his helmet. The dog sat beside him, silent, observant. "Sorry," he said. It was all he managed. Sandra's back remained turned. She hadn't wanted him here. Not now. Not after all the years he'd spent on the road, in prison, hiding from his own name. Melvin didn't argue. He nodded once, then stepped back, joining the mourners from a distance. Diesel lay down at his feet, his eyes never leaving the casket. The funeral was simple, held in the cemetery on the edge of town. The child-sized white coffin rested on a folding platform beneath an old oak tree. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers arranged atop it, white lilies and plastic roses. Pastor Miller read from the Psalms, his voice trembling slightly. "She is gone to be with the Lord. Her struggle is over." But Melvin wasn't listening. Diesel stood suddenly, body tense. Melvin's attention snapped downward. The dog was alert, ears forward, muscles vibrating. Something was wrong. Diesel took a step toward the casket, then another. The murmurs started almost immediately. People shifted, frowning. Someone hissed, "That dog shouldn't be here." Melvin held the leash tighter, but Diesel strained forward. He knew the signs. This wasn't restlessness. This was alert behavior. He crouched beside the dog, whispering softly. Diesel's nose lifted, his breath coming faster. A soft whine escaped his throat, then a bark. Short, sharp, urgent. The mourners gasped. "Get that dog out of here," snapped a woman in a floral hat. Sandra turned around, finally noticing. Her face paled. Diesel moved again, dragging Melvin forward. This time, the leash slipped from his fingers. The German shepherd lunged onto the platform, placing both front paws on the casket. The cemetery fell into stunned silence, and Melvin's heart pounded as he stared at the dog who had never, in all the years they'd been together, been wrong. Aaliyah was in that box, and Diesel was trying to save her. The sharp bark from Diesel echoed across the cemetery like a crack of thunder, silencing every whispered judgment and stiffening every grieving posture. All eyes were on the massive German shepherd now perched atop the small white casket, his body stiff and alert, his expression neither panicked nor aggressive, but focused with an intensity that seemed to cut through the cool spring air. His ears stood upright, his breathing quickened, and a low, urgent whine rumbled from his throat. Melvin Rhodes had seen this behavior before, in war zones, in hospitals, in recovery clinics filled with broken bodies and broken minds. Diesel was trained to detect subtle changes in human physiology. He could smell the chemical markers of anxiety, sense shifts in blood pressure and oxygen levels, detect the faintest whiff of seizures and cardiac anomalies. He had alerted soldiers of internal bleeding before medics even suspected it. He had once found a collapsed veteran in a shelter who would have been pronounced dead had Diesel not insisted otherwise. And now, here at the edge of a grave for a child already declared lost, he was barking with the same furious certainty. Melvin rose slowly, not wanting to startle anyone or the dog. His voice was low, gravelly, but firm as he addressed the stunned crowd. "He's alertin'." The funeral director, a thin man in a dark suit, immediately stepped forward, gesturing with both hands as if trying to restore order in a room full of overturned chairs. "Sir, I must ask you to remove your dog immediately. This is a funeral." "This is my niece," Melvin interrupted, eyes blazing now. "And that dog says she's not gone." Someone scoffed. "What the hell kind of circus is this?" The pastor cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Rhodes, I understand your grief, but this is not the time for confusion. The Lord has called her. She's breathing," Melvin snapped, pointing to Diesel. "That dog doesn't bark like that for a memory. He smells her breath, her pulse, something." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. A few people began to step back. Others clutched their programs tighter, their expressions torn between disbelief and rising discomfort. A man near the front row muttered something about people like Melvin always making scenes. Another muttered the word delusional. Sandra was frozen in place. Her hands clutched each other so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came. For 3 days, she had felt like her soul had been scooped out of her chest. Now, the sight of her brother, who she hadn't seen in years, standing beside a barking dog atop her daughter's coffin threatened to snap something inside her. "Please," she whispered, unsure who she was speaking to. Diesel barked again, sharper this time, and lowered his head toward the casket. His nose brushed against the painted wood. Then came a change. His body stiffened even further, his head tilted, and he gave a soft, trembling whine that sent shivers through Melvin's spine. It was the sound Diesel made when a situation was critical. Melvin stepped up onto the platform beside the dog, ignoring the protests behind him. "Open it," he said, voice low but unwavering. "No," the funeral director replied firmly, now flanked by 2 cemetery staff. "That's not happening. This is a sealed casket prepared for burial. We cannot disturb the body without legal authorization. I'll take full responsibility." "You're not her guardian," the director replied. "Only Miss James can authorize that, and I believe she's not in favor of this disruption." Everyone turned to Sandra. She stood motionless, tears brimming in her eyes. Her body swayed slightly, her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She looked at the casket, then at her brother, then at the dog. Her lips trembled. "She was cold," she whispered. "They said she was cold. They said she was gone." Melvin's face softened just slightly. "They said a lot of things. But you saw how quick they were to stop trying. You saw how long they took to even show up." A murmur of agreement broke the tension. One of the older women near the back nodded and whispered, "Too quick." Another added, "They barely even tried." The crowd had started to shift. What had been a scene of uniform grief was fracturing into discomfort and uncertainty. No one wanted to believe a child had been declared dead by mistake. But no one wanted to be the one who ignored a possibility like this either. Melvin turned to a familiar face in the small crowd. "Marius," he called. A stocky man with dark skin and a salt and pepper beard stepped forward. Marius Langston had been a paramedic and military medic once, like Melvin. They had served on the same medical team before Marius returned home to find his license mysteriously revoked after challenging treatment policies at the same hospital where Aaliyah had died. Since then, he'd been running a small community clinic out of a rented office, treating those who couldn't afford to be seen elsewhere. Marius didn't ask questions. One look at Diesel's posture was enough. "If you open that casket, I'll have to call the police," the funeral director warned. "Then call them," Marius said calmly. "But if there's even a chance this child is alive and you stop us from checking, that's negligence, possibly criminal." The director hesitated. He looked at Sandra, silently begging her to say something definitive. She was shaken now, her mouth pressed into a trembling line. Melvin reached for her hand. "You know she doesn't get second chances," he said softly. "You know how many kids they overlook in that place?" Sandra's hand moved slightly, and then she nodded. It was all the permission he needed. Marius moved to the casket with a quiet authority that made the funeral staff back away. He inspected the seal. "It hasn't been fully locked yet," he said, mostly to himself. "Good." With careful fingers, he began to undo the fastenings. Diesel stepped aside but didn't move from the platform. The cemetery was silent, except for the rustle of the wind through the trees. Marius lifted the lid. A soft gasp moved through the crowd. Aaliyah lay peacefully inside, dressed in her white recital dress, her hands folded over a small plush toy lion. Her face was pale, her lips faintly purple, but there was something about her expression, too relaxed, too present. Marius leaned close, pressing 2 fingers gently to her neck. Then he froze. "I've got something," he said quietly. "Faint, but there. She's got a pulse." Another gasp. One woman dropped her program. A child clutched her mother's skirt. "She's not breathing," Marius added quickly. "We need to start now. Call EMS." Melvin was already pulling out his phone. Sandra dropped to her knees beside the casket, her hand hovering over her daughter's chest. "She's warm," she said, voice trembling. "Oh, God! Oh, God!" Marius began chest compressions, gentle but rhythmic. "She might be in a cataleptic state," he said, mostly to Melvin. "Some neurological conditions can mimic death. The kind of asthma she had, combined with hypoxia and certain medications, it can happen. Then why didn't they check? Sandra cried. Why didn't they see? You know why, Melvin said grimly. The ambulance arrived 5 minutes later. The paramedics loaded Aaliyah carefully, still unconscious but with a visible pulse and the faintest twitch of breath beginning to return. Diesel rode in the back with her, sitting rigidly beside the stretcher, his gaze locked on the little girl he'd refused to let them bury. Melvin and Sandra followed in her battered old Honda, hands shaking, hearts pounding. Word spread before the convoy even reached the hospital. By the time they pulled into the emergency bay, a crowd had gathered. Neighbors, friends, even local reporters alerted by police scanners. Inside, doctors scrambled to take over, confused and skeptical. They ran tests. They demanded to know who had authorized the coffin to be opened. She was declared dead, the attending physician said coldly. Who do you think you are, bringing her back here? Melvin stepped forward. The man who wasn't willing to bury a child just because someone else said it was time. They admitted Aaliyah to the ICU under guarded diagnosis, unresponsive but with stable vitals. Marius stayed by her side, refusing to be dismissed. Sandra stood outside the window, her fingers pressed against the glass. Diesel lay at the foot of the hospital bed, unmoving but watchful. No one knew how long Aaliyah had before being buried would have made the mistake irreversible. No one wanted to ask why such a mistake had been allowed in the first place. But Melvin knew. He had seen it before. Children like Aaliyah, black, poor, from the wrong zip code, were too often the ones written off, too often the ones rushed out of hospital beds and into death certificates without the full weight of care that other children might receive. It was a quiet kind of violence, dressed in protocol and paper, and this time they had nearly gotten away with it. But Diesel had remembered, and Diesel didn't let go. The ICU at Harper's Cross Medical Center buzzed with a quiet chaos that hummed just beneath the surface, like the current in a wire no one could quite see. Behind the reinforced glass walls of room 3B, Aaliyah lay motionless, her small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator. Tubes ran from her arms to fluid bags, machines blinked with the slow pulse of monitored life, and a pale blue hospital gown swallowed her frail form. She had not stirred since being pulled from the casket hours earlier. Her eyes remained shut, and the only sign of her endurance was the steady, unwavering readout on the heart monitor. Sandra hadn't moved from her post since her daughter had been admitted. She sat in the molded plastic chair, hunched forward, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes were dry now. There was no moisture left in them. Only disbelief and a sick, twisting dread that burrowed deeper each time she thought about how close they had come. She could still feel the weight of the coffin lid, the chill of Aaliyah's skin before warmth had returned. She had buried her child, or nearly had, because someone told her to trust the system. Melvin stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the monitors. Diesel lay on the floor near the bed, resting his head on his front paws, though his gaze never left the child. Every so often, his ears would twitch toward a sound in the hallway. Visitors came and went, nurses passed through, but the three of them, Sandra, Melvin, and the dog, remained like sentinels, watching over something far too fragile to leave unattended. Marius entered quietly, a clipboard in one hand, his face drawn. He gave Melvin a glance, then moved to Sandra's side. The attending physician doesn't want to release records yet, he said in a low voice, but I pulled the chart. It's as we thought. Minimal diagnostics were done when she arrived. No blood work, no EEG, no check for cataleptic signs, just a pulse check, visual confirmation, and a rushed sign-off. Sandra looked up at him slowly, her voice hoarse. So, she wasn't dead. She was in a hypoxic state, Marius replied. Severe oxygen deprivation, but it wasn't brain death. If they'd waited, if they'd run a scan, they'd have seen residual function. They didn't even try, she whispered. No, he said, voice flat. They didn't. Outside the room, a low murmur had begun to swell in the hallway. Reporters from the local paper had arrived, flanked by a few community members who'd followed the ambulance. News had spread quickly, too quickly. A child declared dead, found alive during her own funeral, and a war veteran's dog responsible for the discovery. The hospital's administration, caught off guard by the media attention, scrambled to contain the fallout. A spokesperson issued a brief statement expressing concern over the tragic misdiagnosis and promising a full internal review. But the community had already taken sides. Outside, the parking lot had become a stage for debate. Some called it a miracle, others a scandal. A few muttered, just loud enough to be heard, that if Aaliyah had been white, things would have been different. That a different neighborhood, a different set of parents, might have earned a second opinion. It wasn't the first time Harper's Cross had been accused of racial disparity in its medical services. It was just the first time the body got up again. Inside the hospital's administrative wing, a different kind of battle was unfolding. Dr. Walter Hughes stood stiffly in a conference room, flanked by two members of the hospital's legal team. His expression was defensive, chin lifted in defiance. Across from him sat the chief of medicine, a tight-lipped woman in a navy suit who spoke in clipped tones. The media is already moving on this, she said. There are camera crews setting up outside. Your signature is on that death certificate, doctor. Care to explain? I followed protocol, Hughes replied. The girl was unresponsive, with cyanosis and no measurable pulse, no respiration, no pupil reaction. I've declared death on patients for less. Did you perform an EEG? There was no indication it was necessary. No indication, the chief repeated, setting the chart down in front of her. She was 6 years old. She was already gone. And yet, the woman said coolly, she is breathing in the ICU as we speak. Down the hall, Melvin sat in a folding chair outside Aaliyah's room. Sandra had gone to freshen up for the first time since they arrived, and Diesel now rested with his muzzle on Melvin's boot. A uniformed officer walked up and stopped a few feet away. Mr. Rhodes, the officer said. Melvin raised an eyebrow. You're in violation of your parole. You crossed county lines without notification and you participated in a public disturbance. Technically, we could take you in. Melvin didn't answer. The silence between them stretched until the officer cleared his throat. But Chief Wells asked me to tell you that due to the circumstances, she's recommending we hold off, temporarily. Appreciate it, Melvin said. You're a lucky man, the officer muttered. And that's one hell of a dog. After the officer walked off, Marius joined him on the bench, rubbing his face with both hands. They're not going to admit fault, he said. Not publicly. But the whispers are growing. This isn't going away quietly. They'll try to bury it, Melvin replied, just like they tried to bury her. You know this is going to court, Marius said. Good. Sandra returned, her face washed, hair tied back, a semblance of strength returning to her features. She joined them, her voice steady. Then we don't let them bury the truth, not this time. 3 days later, Aaliyah stirred. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible. Her fingers twitched and her eyelids fluttered. Sandra leapt from her chair, calling for a nurse. Diesel stood immediately, whining softly, tail swishing in cautious hope. Monitors began to change, slightly, just enough for the nurse to page the attendant. Aaliyah's eyes opened for 2 seconds, then closed again. By the next day, she opened them for longer. A faint sound escaped her lips, not speech, not quite, but a murmur that made Sandra collapse to her knees beside the bed. Her daughter's eyes were glassy, unfocused, but alive. And when Diesel stepped closer, she lifted her hand slightly, fingers grazing his fur. It was all Melvin needed to see. He stood quietly, left the room, and made the call. The next week was a maelstrom of movement. Lawyers contacted Sandra. Reporters requested interviews. Hospital administrators offered hush settlements, but she refused them all. Instead, she sat down with a civil rights attorney who had handled discrimination cases against medical institutions. Together, they began assembling a case, not just about Aaliyah, but about a system that had, time and again, failed children like her. Melvin, meanwhile, returned to Harper's Cross only once, to retrieve a box of old papers, a journal, and a photograph of himself and Marius in combat uniforms, younger and harder, and unaware of what the world would ask of them later. On the way back, he stopped at the community center, where a group of teenagers clustered around Diesel like he was a superhero. The stories had already begun. Children told their parents about the dog who sniffed life. Local artists painted murals on the brick walls downtown. One depicted Diesel standing over a coffin, his silhouette forming the shape of a heart. Marius pulled him aside afterward. "We can't stop with Aaliyah," he said. "There are more out there, more kids, more mistakes." Melvin nodded. "What are you thinking?" "A program," Melvin said, "rescue dogs, trained to detect, placed with kids who need them, families who can't afford help. We call it Second Breath." "I'll run the medical side," Marius said immediately. "If you build it, I'll back it." Sandra approved. She wasn't the same woman who'd sat trembling at the funeral. She was steel now, forged in trauma and returned with fire. That week, they filed the nonprofit paperwork. They launched a website, and they posted a single image on the front page, a photograph of Aaliyah in her hospital bed, her hand resting on Diesel's neck, and a caption that read, "He remembered when they forgot." The hospital tried to save face. Dr. Hughes quietly resigned. A committee was formed to evaluate death declaration protocols, but no apology ever came. No one admitted fault. They didn't need to. The world was already watching. And somewhere, deep inside the rhythm of recovery, Aaliyah blinked her eyes open, reached once more for her lined plush, and whispered her first words since awakening. "Good boy." Melvin heard her through the glass. He smiled. There was still a fight ahead, but this round was theirs. The first snowfall came early that year, sweeping down from the hills in a curtain of quiet white. It dusted the rooftops of Harper's Cross like powdered sugar, settled gently on the cracked sidewalks, and blanketed the fields behind the hospital where the wind blew without obstruction. The town hushed beneath its weight, as if nature itself had paused to witness the aftermath of something profound. In a modest, one-story house on the edge of town, the James household had transformed, not just in appearance, but in spirit. Inside, the warmth of life had returned, even if carefully, like a candle guarded from the wind. The living room had become a hub of quiet activity, its furniture rearranged to accommodate new routines. A small therapy mat lay rolled in the corner beside a shelf filled with children's books and puzzles. A lift device stood discreetly near the hall, and a series of handrails had been installed along the walls leading toward the bedrooms. What had once been a home, shadowed by silence, was now the heart of a recovery. Aaliyah sat in her wheelchair on the back porch, bundled in a thick knit scarf and a sky blue winter coat. Her legs were covered with a fleece blanket, her hands gloved, but her face was turned upward to meet the falling snow. Her breath came in soft clouds, and her eyes followed the swirling flakes like they were fireflies. Each movement she made was deliberate, small victories that would have gone unnoticed by most, but meant the world to those around her. Beside her sat Diesel, no longer merely a working dog, but a member of the family in the truest sense. He had traded his black tactical vest for a custom-fitted blue one, with Aaliyah's initials embroidered along the side, along with a patch that read Medical Alert K9. The city had granted him honorary service status. He wore it like a badge. Aaliyah's speech had returned slowly. At first, she struggled with simple words, her vocal cords unfamiliar with coordination after the trauma. But through hours of therapy and the steady encouragement of those around her, her voice had come back, soft, measured, and full of light. She still tired easily. Her right hand sometimes trembled, but she was here, alive, awake, learning again. "Snow is soft," she said, reaching out her gloved hand to catch a flake. "Diesel likes snow." Diesel tilted his head, then nudged her arm gently with his nose, as if in agreement. Inside, Sandra was chopping vegetables for soup. The kitchen had grown warmer since spring, not just from the season, but from purpose. Her movements were calm, deliberate, steady in a way they hadn't been since the night she thought she'd lost her daughter forever. The scars from that trauma hadn't vanished, but they had formed into something different, calluses over the broken places. She had returned to work on a part-time basis at a nearby clinic, but most of her energy went into Aaliyah's care. Not out of obligation, out of fierce, unshakable love. At the kitchen table, Melvin sat with Marius and Sarah Whitfield, a local business consultant who had helped nonprofits launch across the region. Papers were spread between them, registration forms, training protocols, drafts of grant applications. The logo for their new organization was emblazoned on the header, Second Breath Foundation. "We've got 3 partner clinics already confirmed," Sarah said, tapping her pen on the margin of a document. "They're on board with hosting dogs for observation. That covers the pilot phase. After that, we'll need video documentation for the grant reports." Melvin nodded. "We'll film sessions with Diesel and Aaliyah. Nothing staged, just the real stuff. That's what people respond to." "Speaking of Diesel," Marius added, flipping through a training manual, "I've been in contact with a former K9 officer out of Baton Rouge. He runs a detection dog academy. He's willing to send his lead trainer for 2 months to work with the first round of dogs." Sandra glanced up from the stove. "Will the dogs all come from shelters?" Melvin looked over. "That's the plan. Rescues mostly from high euthanasia counties. If they're healthy and pass temperament tests, they'll be trained for pediatric alert work. Every one of them placed with a child who needs them." Sarah smiled. "It's beautiful. I've never seen something grow this quickly from something so painful." "It was never just about Aaliyah," Sandra said softly. "It started with her, but it was always about more than one child." The following week, they received the formal settlement offer from the hospital's legal team. The envelope arrived without ceremony, hand-delivered by a courier who didn't know what he was carrying. The letter inside was concise, offering a substantial financial settlement in exchange for non-disclosure and the dismissal of any pending legal action. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, only a dollar amount, high enough to speak for itself. Sandra sat quietly after reading it, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. Melvin waited, his jaw tight. "We could fight," she said finally. "We'd probably win." "We'd drag it out for years," Marius replied, "and they'd bury us in motions and appeals. Then we take it," she said, looking down the hallway toward Aaliyah's room. "We take it, and we build something that outlives them." With the settlement, the foundation moved from dream to reality. A small building near the city's edge was leased and renovated. It had once been a tractor parts warehouse. Now it was gutted and filled with clean floors, wide training corridors, kennels outfitted with blankets and chew toys, and a therapy room where children and dogs would learn one another's rhythms. Aaliyah was the foundation's first ambassador. She appeared in the opening video, filmed by a local college student in film school, where she looked into the camera and introduced herself slowly, proudly. "My name is Aaliyah. This is Diesel. He is not just a dog. He is my friend. He saved me." The video spread faster than anyone expected. Local news ran it first. Then regional outlets picked it up. Before long, a national morning show requested an interview. Sandra declined, but sent a letter, thanking them and including a photograph, Aaliyah in her wheelchair, Diesel beside her, a snowfall glittering behind them. Applications poured in from families across the country. Not all the letters were kind. Some questioned the validity of Aaliyah's condition. Others accused the foundation of exploiting trauma. One message, unsigned, claimed it was suspicious that a black child received so much attention when others had gone unnoticed. Sandra read them without comment. Melvin deleted them before they could do harm. They had expected backlash. They didn't care. Aaliyah's health continued to improve. Her therapists were amazed. Her neurologist called it a textbook example of neuroplasticity aided by emotional anchors. But Melvin knew what had really saved her. Not textbooks, not machines, connection, instinct, faith that refused to leave the grave. In early spring, the city hosted a recognition ceremony for the foundation. It was modest, a gathering at the community center, with folding chairs and a sheet cake, but it meant something. Melvin stood beside Aaliyah as she handed Diesel a ribbon threaded through a plastic medallion. "For being the best boy," she said clearly. Everyone clapped. After the ceremony, Chief Wells pulled Melvin aside. "The charges against you are officially dismissed," she said. "Parole violation, the cemetery incident, it's gone. Consider this an acknowledgement of something bigger." He nodded. "You're not the same man you were," she added. "No," he said, "and I'm not going back." Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Melvin stood on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars. Sandra joined him, folding her arms against the chill. They stood side by side in silence for a while. "She still asks about her dad," she said finally. "Not often, but sometimes." Melvin didn't speak. "She deserves better. I didn't give her much, but she has you now." "She has herself," Melvin replied. "That girl, she's fire." They smiled. Behind them, the house was filled with the sounds of life. Dishes clinking, a dog shaking his fur, a child humming a song learned in therapy. In the morning, the snow returned, thin and light. Aaliyah insisted on going outside. Sandra helped her into her coat, wrapped her scarf tight, and wheeled her onto the porch. Diesel bounded into the yard, leaving a trail of prints behind him. "Look," Aaliyah said, pointing. His tracks curved in the snow, looping, circling, forming a shape. "A heart," she whispered. Sandra knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close. Diesel returned, pressing his body against a wheelchair, his gaze soft and steady. Melvin stepped out with his camera, capturing the moment. That photo would become the signature image of the Second Breath Foundation. It would hang on the walls of future buildings, appear on pamphlets, and be sent in thank you letters to donors. It would stand as proof of what could happen when people refused to give up. When love crossed the borders of speech, species, and survival. When a heartbeat, almost lost, was heard by someone who knew how to listen. It wasn't just a story, it was a promise. And it had only just begun. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and check out our other videos for stories that stay with you long after they end.